My second semester is officially over.
Hello, Editing Angel here. So, my second semester has actually been over for quite a while now. I filmed this in late May, early June, and it is currently July. I've just been very, very busy lately, so, well, better late than never.
The end of it got pretty crazy. More like workload crazy. It wasn't like, well, there was also things that happened that were kind of crazy, but like they didn't heavily involve me. I'm also not going to talk about them. But the end of the semester got really busy. It generally is. And I wanted to recap my second semester as a full-time college student. Just as a reminder, I am a BSW student, Bachelor of Social Work, at the University of Houston downtown. I'm currently a senior, and I am the president of Phi Alpha Honor Society, which kind of more goes into like a lot of the things that I had to do this semester and a lot of why my semester was so busy. I took 5 classes this semester. I took Research Methods in Social Work, Urban Issues in the Global Environment, Urban Practice 2, Crisis Intervention, and Directed Study in Social Work. I made a introduction to this semester video, I think back in January or December, I can't remember which. And I like making these because it's cool for me to be able to go back and look at what my preconceived notions of what these classes would be are versus what they ended up being and how much I ended up liking or not so much liking them. For now, let's just talk about my classes. Let's start with talking about research methods. So research methods, when we're talking about the assignments, the first few were a couple of quizzes based on textbook chapters. We did have a midterm assignment, which was an annotated bibliography along with a literature review outline. Now, it was described as a detailed literature review outline, and a lot of people were very confused about what exactly she was looking for. This particular teacher had not taught the class before, so she didn't really have any examples of what you could do or what you were supposed to do. But she was super helpful. If you sent stuff to her, she helped you out. A lot of us just kind of hyper analyzed it, and I actually got 100 on this paper, and I ended up doing so well, and my teacher loved it so much that she actually asked me if she could use it in the future as an example to other students when she teaches the class, which was super, super cool. If you're curious what I did it on the relationship between borderline personality disorder and non-suicidal self-injury amongst adolescent populations, which is actually genuinely something that I'm very, very interested in. Personality disorders in general, I think, are things that need to be far more heavily researched. I know borderline is probably one of the more heavy researched ones out of the personality disorders, but I do think there's a lot of research we can do on that, which could help a lot with breaking down stigma. There's a lot of stigma around personality disorders, but I'm not gonna get into that. I might make a whole video on that because it is genuinely something that interests me. We then had to create something called an informed consent form. Whenever people participate in a research study, they have to sign something called an informed consent form. I think it's an assent form if you're doing minors, but we didn't have to make that. The informed consent form for me, I had to create a section for the parents to sign because I was working with minors and the minors can't consent, their parents have to consent. It was essentially just making one based on a template we were given that was fill in the blank and very, very simple, very easy to understand. And our final exam was something called the methodology paper. And the methodology paper was actually far more simple than you think it was. It was just the methods section of a research paper. So we had to create a study. We had to create the methods for a study that we wanted to conduct or that we could conduct. It was all about the preparation of doing a research study. I stuck with borderline personality disorder and non-suicidal self-injury. And what my study was aimed to do was look more into the relationship between the symptoms of borderline personality disorder and non-suicidal self-injury. So I think mine was you took 2 groups, one group of adolescents with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder that I think I said would be pulled from a behavioral health or a psychiatric hospital in the Houston area because that's where I'm from. And then the other group would just be recruited from online surveys and stuff. And they would be administered 3 structured clinical interviews to ensure a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, or in order to make sure that, there wasn't something underlying on the healthy side. Then they were going to be administered the inventory of statements about self-injury, the difficulties in emotion regulation scale, the Barrett impulsiveness scale, and the Buss-Perry aggression scale version 11, I believe. I might have mixed some of those names up, but I believe those were the 4 that I chose because they're all like, they were either gold standard or I thought one was more comprehensive than the other. And I had to figure out how the statistical data analysis would be done. I didn't have to go too far into it. I just stuck with linear regression. I essentially did what she said. She said, look at other studies that use the measurement tools you are using and find out how they analyze the data. So I pretty much did that. I actually really enjoyed this class. I had a lot more fun in it than I thought I would, and I ended up getting an A. Let's move on to urban issues in the global environment. So when it came to the lecture part of this class, I actually want to talk a little bit about that as well. It was far less of a lecture and far more of just a conversation about different topics, which were just urban issues in the global environment. We didn't really talk a lot about globalization. We talked about modern problems, modern things going on in the world. And something I really enjoyed is that social work tends to be a very left-leaning field. The National Association of Social Workers takes a very liberal stance, and I didn't only hear liberal points of view and liberal talking points. I think there's far more nuance to the world than it is often given credit for, and I think that the National Association of Social Workers has a very hard time acknowledging that nuance at times. But I don't want to get into the politics of it. I think that's problematic, and I think it's far too divisive. Something my professor said that I actually really appreciated hearing her say was that she didn't want you to believe her. She wanted us to figure stuff out on our own. She wanted us to form our own opinions, create our own points of view on the research and the merits that we have, and I really appreciated that in this class. I'd also like to say I have a lot of respect for this particular professor. There was an incident within this class with another student, and this woman handled it very professionally. God, she was just put through hell. Let me tell you, my heart breaks because this is the second class I've had with her, and I love her. I've learned so much from her. I've got nothing but love and respect from this woman. And I have nothing but love and respect for this woman. And I just wanted to state that she really was put through hell by another student. She was essentially being bullied, and she didn't back down. She stood her ground, and she was strong, and she was like, you're not going to intimidate me. You're not going to put me down. And I have so much respect for that. Now let's talk about the assignments. The first assignment, I kind of separate them into 2 major categories. The first set was called Challenges in the Modern World. You were assigned a topic. You literally drew it out of a hat. You were randomly assigned groups of 3 to 4 people, and our group got the informal and alternative economy and contingency work. And what you had to do was very broad, very sweeping. We ended up talking about like a million different things. What I ended up focusing on was actually the contingency work and temporary work part of things. Just for my part of what was the first part of it, which was a group presentation we had to give. And then you had to write a paper over your particular section. So it really wasn't that difficult. It was a lot of fun. I love giving group presentations. I love talking to my classmates, and I love getting engagement from them. I think it's such a fun experience, and I overall enjoyed that project. I'd say our topic was a little bit weird and a little bit hard, but I enjoyed doing it. Next up, we had the comparative policy analysis assignment. Now, this was set into 3 parts. You had to pick a US policy and a global policy that covered similar topics and compare the 2. Compare and contrast, find what was similar, what was different, which policy do you think was better, how do you think we can make this essentially a better law surrounding this issue. You could do this alone or with a partner. I chose to do it with a partner, and we talked about the Amber Alert. We talked about Amber Alert laws, and a lot of people are sitting here thinking, Angel, you're a social work major. This is a criminal justice issue. And you're right, it is a criminal justice issue. It's also an issue of social work and social justice. I mean, when we look at the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children's website, they don't just cover kidnappings. They cover human trafficking, grooming, sextortion, and a lot of my information came from that. There is a huge intersection that people don't quite realize between the criminal justice system and social work. And I loved being able to analyze Amber Alerts from the lens of a social worker and the lens of someone who is looking at this as a human rights issue, because child abduction in general, is a human rights issue. This is an issue of child endangerment and the safety of children. We looked specifically at the very first ever law in the world to formalize Amber Alerts, and that was Executive Order RP16, signed into law by Governor Rick Perry, I believe in like the early 2000s, I think 03 maybe. And if you don't know about the history of Amber Alerts, I had to make an entire video presentation on it for the final product with my partner, and it talked a lot about the story of a little girl named Amber Renee Hagerman, who is who the law is named after, or the Amber Alert is named after, not the law. We compared RP 16 to a French bill, because I speak French and so does the other girl. And if I remember, it's not a formalized bill or policy. In a lot of other countries, there are simply agreements that are written out between different organizations and the government. In this case, it's Le Ministère de la Justice and different media outlets in France. And I believe the written agreement is called Plan de l'aide de la population en cas d'enlèvement d'un mineur. I think that's what it's called. It roughly translates to a plan for alerting the public in the case of the abduction of a minor or a child. That's roughly what it translates to. And we were able to look at like how things are different in France, how things are different around the world. It was actually very interesting. We ended up talking at the end about how the only group of abducted people who are left out of Amber Alerts currently, when we look at the criteria, at one point familial abductions were also left out, but currently the only group left out are runaways, and they make up the bulk of missing children. We talked about how, there needs to be a system to alert about them. Amber Alerts have been proven to be helpful. In my opinion, if they save one kid and contribute to rescuing or recovering one child, that's justification enough for keeping them. There's a lot of statistics out there that, are they successful 100% of the time? No, I don't even think they're successful like 50%. But they are still cited as the reason for many abducted children being returned home. And a lot of the time, those cited reasons are because the public recognized the last car they were in, or the abductor, or the child's description. That means that these descriptions are important and that people who see them are recognizing these children. I don't know. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. That's another conversation for another day. But I got the A in the class and I liked it. I had a genuinely good time in this class. Next, we're getting more into like what I'm calling my less assignment intensive classes. I think this one's like smack dab in the middle for how intensive the assignments were. It was Urban Practice 2. It was taught by a new lady. She was very interesting. I found some of our class activities fun. There was one time where we had to argue against a bill fining parents for children not wearing helmets when they rode bikes. And we were randomly assigned to groups, and I was randomly assigned to be a part of the coalition of parents against helmets. So I had to argue why this law was like bad or ineffective. I thought that activity was fun. Sometimes I would sit in class and I'd be like, I'm kind of bored right now. But it was her first time teaching this. It was her first year, but she had some great activities. So I enjoyed the class generally. We had 3 assignments that we did throughout the semester. We did a windshield assessment, which is essentially where you like drive through a community and you quite literally just like look around and see things about the community. You look at, are there a lot of community spaces? Are there a lot of public spaces? How are the road conditions? Things like that. Is there a lot of crime in the area? Is it well lit at night? Then we had to talk to 2 people just about the community and what they thought about it. Then from that, you created something called a SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. And you just quite literally went through your windshield analysis and categorized the strengths of the community, the weaknesses of the community, the opportunity in the community, and the threats in the community. It was actually far easier than you would think. The final thing, which I think took the most time, was you had to create like a community program and have an oral pitch to go with it. The community program I created, I believe, was called Pave the Way, and I had noticed there were a lot of potholes and the parking lots weren't well poured in the particular community that we drove through. And so I was like, oh, this will be like hardscaping and road maintenance for the community. And that was actually pretty interesting. I talked about the economic impact that driving through a pothole and tearing the sidewall of your tire has on people sometimes. I thought it was interesting. It was a far more micro-focused social work practice class, but I do think it was interesting and it was important and it was good information to learn. I got an A and I overall had a pretty good time in the class. Next up is the class that I was the most excited to take, and that is crisis interventions. We had a lot of lectures and the lectures were full of good information. I really think the only pitfall was that it was over Zoom at 7:15. Like, that's when the class started. No, 7. It started at 7. Still late, though. Like, it went to 8:15. At that point, I had had class all day. I had urban issues and urban practice, and I was quite tired. But I enjoyed the class, and I got some pretty good information from it. I actually, for all of our assignments, we completed completed different like certifications and training. For example, I have Ask Basic Gatekeeper training, which is a suicide prevention training, psychological first aid training, which is a lot about disaster response. I also did something called Calm training, which is counseling on access to lethal means. This is another suicide prevention thing. It really was just about you're talking to someone who's suicidal, figuring out how to navigate that situation. And lastly, we had the trauma-informed care training, which was through the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, I believe. Trauma-informed care is something we learn a lot about in social work. It really is just what it sounds like. It is treating situations and people through a trauma-informed lens, understanding that trauma has a major impact on people and that every trauma is going to affect every person differently. I think that I got a lot of good information from all 4 of these certifications. And I get to throw them on my resume. I got an A in the class because pretty much all you had to do was complete the certifications and you got an A. I overall didn't enjoy the class as much as I thought I would, but really mostly that was because of the time. But I'm very glad I took it. And I'm very glad I took it with the woman I took it with. She was not our original teacher, but she is like an expert in crisis intervention. She was actually pulled in very last minute. She also teaches at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. She teaches the same class there. And yeah, I had a really good time in this class. And last but certainly not least was my directed study in social work under the Household Centered Care program. This was graded very oddly. The only assignment I actually did was write a reflection about my experience. I attended 3 seminars throughout the semester and I went on as many home visits as I could, and these home visits weren't always at people's homes. I actually only went to 2. One was at like a restaurant food pantry type thing, and the woman only spoke Spanish and I spoke no Spanish, but I could understand certain things she was saying just because French also has a Latin base. So I was able to like pick up on like certain little things she was saying here and there. The second lady spoke English, thankfully, and I was able to engage with her a little bit more, but we didn't get to go on so many like home visits as a team because the scheduling of the 3 different colleges that we were working with the medical college at the University of Houston, the nursing school at the University of Houston. There were a lot of problems with this program, but for something that's just starting up, it's pretty good. Something I took note of was how supportive everyone was of each other in that program. For example, when we told the medical students that nursing students and social work students had to pay to park, we had to pay to go to this college and pay to park to go to seminars we're required to be in. We're already paying for the class. They were up in arms for us. They were also upset because something that we didn't realize, or at least I didn't realize, is that the medical students are required to go to these things. And the nursing students are as well. Let's say you scheduled a doctor's appointment months in advance. Generally, you'd get your invitation to a home visit maybe a week in advance. It's like the earliest I ever got one. And it was a nightmare if you couldn't go. The nursing students often missed class for these things. They were missing one of their most difficult classes. And I missed a class. Like, I missed research methods, but I could always go to a makeup class, and I know that not every program and not every school has that option. I will say something that the social work students were a lot more open to was repetition of learning about things like trauma-informed care, appreciative inquiry, psychological safety, the strengths-based approach, and the social determinants of health. Like the medical and the nursing students, especially the medical students, were like, we learned about this already. We don't need to learn about it again. Like, it's too repetitive. I'm a firm believer in repetition is key. Like, you need to be repeating content in order to figure it out, in order to really learn it, in order to really understand it, and like be able to digest it properly. However, I do understand that maybe they wanted, to build on it more. But other than that, it was a really good experience. I'm very, very glad I did it. I had a very, very good time, and I think I learned a lot. I also obviously got an A. So now I want to talk a little bit about something I didn't talk about last semester because, well, it wasn't like a thing last semester. I want to talk about running a student organization. So I am the president of the Phi Alpha Honor Society for Social Work. And that was some extra work. That was things that I had to do. So we had members meetings and officer meetings monthly. Something that we found that worked really well for us was when our officer meetings were an hour before our members meetings, because our officer meetings generally didn't take that long. We do all of our meetings and stuff over Zoom unless we're doing a special occasion or an event, which I'll talk about. And like, we would create the slideshow. We also had to talk a lot about, hey, run for officer positions, because our vice president and our secretary treasurer did graduate. So I am the only remaining returning officer. We did find replacements and they are both phenomenal. I'm very excited to be working with both of these women. I attended the monthly Council of Organizations meetings. The Council of Organizations is an absolute nightmare at my college, but that is all I'm gonna say about it. So this semester we had 4 different events. We had the induction ceremony, which I was the first one to bring it back in person since COVID. I felt like it was really important for people to get to come in person if they wanted to. We also had a can opener drive, which was in partnership with another social work organization. We had Poppy's Run for Life. It was a 5K fun run. All the proceeds went to suicide prevention. I believe it went to the Alexander Jewish Family Association. It's called Alexander JFS, and I believe the Montrose Center. And our last event of the year was the cord ceremony / end of year celebration. The cord ceremony is for our graduating members. They get their cords, we honor them, and we all just hang out and have a good time. We had a great time. It was definitely some adjustment because I wasn't used to running a student organization. I had no idea what running an organization was like. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had a really, really, really good time, and I cannot wait for all the events I'll be doing with Phi Alpha next semester. Now for fun, let's just rank my classes, because why not? First up, we have research methods. That was my favorite class of the semester. I loved it so much more than I thought I would. I had such a good time in that class. I loved the research topic I chose. I loved creating my midterm. I loved my methodology paper. There were times where I sat there and I was like, oh, I don't want to do this, but at the same time, it was a topic I liked, so I enjoyed doing the research. I'd say my second favorite was actually my directed study, and I'd say that because I genuinely enjoyed going to these seminars and going to the home visits and doing all of these things because it was so cool to get to network and to speak to people from different walks of life and also from like different backgrounds and who were studying different fields. I think we all learned a lot from each other, and again, everyone was so nice, and I just had such a genuinely fun time at all of these seminars and all my home visits. Next up, we have urban issues because I loved my teacher. I loved that class. I loved the discussions. Unfortunately, crisis intervention falls at number 4. It was just so late in the day that I could not focus. And then 5th was urban practice 2, solely because I felt kind of bored sometimes when I was in class. And also, like, it wasn't my area. It wasn't my thing. My ranking is arbitrary. I enjoyed all my classes. All right. Brooklyn is mad. Stay safe, stay smart, work hard. Bye.